Deku, I think he's some pro. By clouds. My head in the clouds, not coming down. Chapter 20. You reap what you sow. When Izuku woke up in Recovery Girl's office, Aizawa was standing over him with an expression that was an odd mix of relieved, afraid, and absolutely pissed.
Give me one good reason why I shouldn't expel him right now.
Izuku bit his lip. This is what he was worried about, since he learned that Aizawa had expelled an entire class of first-year students for being just like Katsuki, but he just couldn't expel him. His entire life, there were only two things that Izuku had known with absolute certainty, and those were that all men were not created equal, and that Katsuki Bakugo would be a truly amazing hero. Izuku just couldn't bring himself to be the reason that one of those truths came crashing down around his ears. He opened his mouth to say so, taking a deep breath before closing it again. Would Katsuki be an amazing hero? Truly? Izuku paused, remembering all the times Katsuki had put him in his place simply because he'd been born weaker. Was that someone who would be able to protect the weak like a hero was supposed to do? Or was that someone who just wanted a license to beat people up? What about all the teachers who had just watched, praising Katsuki's quirk and pushing all the blame on Izuku for causing trouble? What had they done to make sure Katsuki would be a great hero, besides assuring him that he was better than everyone else? Wasn't it their responsibility to guide him, not Izuku's? Because it's not his fault. Aizawa let out an angry exhale, running his fingers through his hair.
It's not yours either, problem child.
Izuku looked up at him. I know. That threw Aizawa for a loop. He looked at Izuku with wide eyes for a long moment, before sitting next to him on the bed.
And then why, after everything he's done to you, why does he deserve a place at UA?
Izuku took a deep breath, speaking slowly as he tried to untangle what he was thinking. It's not his fault that he's the way he is. Did you know that the teachers knew he was beating me up? They never told anyone, especially my mom, even though everyone knew. Katsuki still has a spotless record because it was easier to blame me, and they didn't want to ruin their chances of being associated with such an amazing hero. No one has ever told him what he's doing is wrong. They've told him that it's his right as the strongest to prey on the weak, and that there are people in this world that no one should care about. Izuku looked at Aizawa. You shouldn't expel him because he's never truly had the chance to succeed. He's still young and it's not too late. If someone tries, maybe Katsuki can still be a great hero. Aizawa scowled and clenched his fists a few times.
Fine, he said, but I'm still making him go to mandatory anger management therapy.
He stood and headed towards the door to talk to Nezu, but Izuku grabbed his hand. Razor. He looked up at Aizawa with a small smile. Thank you. Aizawa rolled his eyes and ruffled Izuku's hair.
Whatever. Problem child.
He had his hand on the door when Izuku realized one last thing. Razor, wait! Aizawa looked at him with one eyebrow raised. Don't tell him I didn't want him to be expelled. He frowned. It won't go over well. Aizawa nodded and opened the door, heading down the hall. Izuku sighed and ran his fingers through his hair again. Hopefully, he'd made the right decision.
Bakugo, would you and your parents follow me, please?
Aizawa led the three into Nezu's office, where the principal was already waiting. He'd already talked to him about what Deku had said, and they'd come up with a plan. As Deku's friend, Aizawa would really rather expel the brat, but as a teacher he had to admit it made a grudging sort of sense. It wouldn't be rational to expel Bakugo when this kind of behavior had been ignored and even encouraged in the past, if Deku was to be believed. If the brat messed up, however, he'd kick him to the curb. Bakugo glared at everything in the office as if it had personally offended him, which, maybe, from his perspective it had. He certainly seemed to think that Deku was trying to offend him, even when the kid had done nothing wrong. His mother was just as loud as he was, just less angry, while Aizawa would almost forget his father was there if he didn't physically take up space. It was definitely an interesting family dynamic, and it made Aizawa wonder if the schools were entirely responsible for what Bakugo had become. He stood silently in the corner, watching as Nezu smiled pleasantly at the family. "Thank you so much for coming in. We apologize again for pulling you away from your work, but this issue is better addressed immediately." Mitsuki nodded. "It's all right, Principal Sir. What's this about, anyway? You were kind of vague on the phone." Nezu clapped his hands together. "Well, it seems as though some rather troubling patterns in your son's behavior have come to light, and we would like to discuss how these will be addressed moving forward." "What kind of patterns?" Mitsuki looked at the principal suspiciously, but it was Aizawa that answered.
"His behavior is excessively aggressive and even violent."
"Oh, that's just Katsuki," Mitsuki smiled. "He's an explosive boy, comes with his quirk." Aizawa scowled. He saw what Deku meant when he said it was the adult's fault Bakugo's behavior hadn't been checked.
"In a battle exercise earlier today, your son knowingly used an attack that could have killed or seriously injured his opponent. It is only due to that student's training and quick reflexes that he was able to dodge."
Bakugo scoffed, and Aizawa glared at him.
"It has also come to our attention that he has a history of assaulting that same student in the past."
"Deku lies."
Bakugo practically spat the words, and it was all Aizawa could do not to strangle him right then. Nezu raised an eyebrow at Bakugo. "That may have been what your teachers have chosen to believe in the past, but let us assure you that we will not be guilty of their same failures." "What does this have to do with Izuku?" Mitsuki asked. "What about the other student in the exercise?" "Izuku Midoriya was the other student in the exercise," Nezu said cheerfully. "He was admitted to the hero course on recommendations. I met him before school year and suspected he had problems with bullying, which was only confirmed by your son's behavior. Were you aware, Bakugo, that such behavior could prevent you from becoming a hero?" Bakugo's eyes widened in shock, and Mitsuki practically started vibrating in rage. "You can't keep Katsuki from becoming a hero. He's perfect for hero work and has been working so hard. It's been his dream since he was a kid." Aizawa wanted to scream about how her son had tried to crush Deku's dream for a decade, and what was she doing then? Masaru looked like he was trying to become one with the chair as his wife stood and leaned over Nezu's desk, veins clearly visible on her forehead. Nezu just held up his hands placatingly. "We are not planning on expelling your son. At least not today. If you will please return to your seat, we will discuss our next course of action." Mitsuki sat back down, but didn't stop glaring at Nezu, who was still smiling. "Perfect. Now, as we said before, these patterns are very concerning, and will not be allowed to continue. If young Bakugo here wishes to remain enrolled here at UA, he will be required to attend anger management therapy with Hound Dog, our school counselor, twice weekly during his free period." Bakugo's jaw dropped.
"What? Why the fuck should I have to talk to some stupid shrink? I'm not fucking crazy."
"Changes need to be made, Bakugo," Nezu said calmly, "and therapy will be the most effective way of assisting you to make those changes, as well as monitoring your progress."
"I'm not going to fucking therapy!"
Bakugo slammed his smoking hands on Nezu's desk.
"Then you'll be expelled and may face criminal charges for assault," Aizawa said simply. "Same goes for if you attend therapy but don't make any progress. We don't need heroes running around who are going to abuse their power.
Bakugo scowled, and smoking, but sat down. Mitsuki cuffed him upside the head.
Come on, brat. It's your own fault, apparently.
I'm sure it won't be that bad, Katsuki, Masaru said softly. Bakugo just scoffed.
We done here or what?
You'll just need to sign this, stating that you understand the conditions of your continued enrollment and that you agree to them. And then you're free to go, Nezu said cheerfully. The family left as soon as the paperwork was done, and Aizawa groaned as soon as the door closed.
Is it wrong that I want him to mess up so I can expel him?
Nezu hummed and sipped his tea. His behavior up until now has been cruel, but I believe Deku is right in saying that no one has tried to correct his behavior before. He may have genuinely thought he was in the right, or might simply have not known how to change. He set down his cup and sighed. I just hope we're not too late. Chapter 21. All Might. Toshinori didn't know what to think. When he'd first seen a little boy with green hair in the first-year hero class, he hadn't thought much of it. The boy was familiar, but he'd been so busy training young Tagada in the last few months that he was having trouble placing him. Toshinori's first thought was that the boy must be a fan or something, someone he'd run into at a convention or an autograph signing. It would be odd that he would remember a face from something like that, but it would explain the uncomfortable feeling of recognition that he felt. But there was a problem. The boy didn't act like a fan. Someone who Toshinori would have run into at a convention would likely be ecstatic to see him as their teacher, smiling brightly or even asking for an autograph like the other students. Instead, this boy frowned and tried hard not to catch his eye, practically running from the room the moment Toshinori told them to go get dressed. Then came the battle exercise. Honestly, Toshinori hadn't thought much of having the boy, Midoriya, he'd learned, go first. It was just the luck of the draw, but he'd hoped that maybe seeing the boy fight would help him figure out where he recognized him from. Watching Midoriya fight the boy with the explosion quirk, Bakugo, was concerning. All Might listened to their conversation through the radios he'd given them and didn't like what they heard. The two seemed to know each other, but weren't friends, if the intense way they attacked one another was any indication. And then Bakugo had let slip that Midoriya was quirkless, and suddenly it clicked. Is it possible to become a hero, even if I don't have a quirk? He looked different from the scrawny kid that had clung onto his leg almost a year ago. He'd filled out, for one thing, and for another, he carried himself with much more confidence than he had a year ago. But it was undeniably the same boy Toshinori had almost considered giving one for all to. Toshinori had almost stopped the fight right then. He remembered how it felt to be quirkless, to not be able to do anything because he didn't have any power. Someone without a quirk couldn't dream of facing down such a powerful opponent, but the boy had already done the smart thing and run away. Hopefully he'd have the sense to stay away from the fight and leave the fighting to those who were actually capable of fighting back, but then Bakugo had cornered him and unleashed an explosion against Toshinori's protests. He'd felt his heart sink when the smoke cleared, and there was no sign of Midoriya on the cameras. This was why it was too dangerous for someone like him to try and be a hero. What had Nezu been thinking letting him into the hero course? Midoriya had reappeared, injured but alive, and taken down Bakugo quickly and effectively, although Toshinori wondered just how he'd gotten permission to use a gun. It wasn't long after that he was able to execute a winning strategy with Uraraka to take down Ida and recover the bomb. The class had even been a 50-50 split in who the MVP had been, Midoriya or Ida. So, in short, Toshinori didn't know what to think. On the one hand, Midoriya had won, and Toshinori remembered from his notebook that the boy was intelligent, but at the end of the day he was still quirkless, which would always be an insurmountable liability in the field. Surely the other teachers would see it that way. All the teachers were gathered in the teacher's lounge to celebrate a successful first day. Power Loader had told them that it was tradition to come together and talk about their students, making predictions for the upcoming year, and Midnight had even brought a bottle of wine that was being distributed liberally. Nezu and Aizawa had said they were going to be late, something about taking care of an issue with one of the new students, so Toshinori decided he'd wait until they arrived to breach the subject of young Midoriya.
Yep, Midnight laughed. I'm pretty certain that the second years hate me right now. I assigned them to find a piece of pre-quirk hero art and write an essay comparing it to a more modern piece. I'm sure they'll love it after it's done, but you should have seen some of the looks they gave me. Happens every year.
Power Loader sighed.
At least you didn't have one of your first years blow something up on the first day. We weren't even supposed to be making anything today. I don't even know how she managed it.
The door opened, and Nezu and Aizawa walked in. Toshinori thought Aizawa looked a little more tired than usual, but he hadn't known the man very long, so he wasn't really sure.
What could have exhausted him that much on the first day? So, what'd you guys have to take care of? Mike yelled from the couch. Don't tell me you expelled a student already.
Aizawa sighed.
I wish.
He sat down and accepted the glass of wine Midnight offered him.
One of my students is the kid that's been bullying Deku for most of his life.
Toshinori thought the name Deku sounded somewhat familiar. Wasn't that what Bakugo had called Midoriya? Wasn't it also the name of some underground analyst Tagada and Midnight were working with?
What a coincidence!
It didn't seem like a very common name.
What?
Midnight's jaw dropped.
And you didn't expel him?
Nezu clapped his hands together. Deku insisted we give him a chance to clean up his act before kicking him out, and I was inclined to agree. We've made therapy a mandatory requirement for his continued enrollment here. He looked at Hound Dog. I hope it will be okay that we've made him bi-weekly appointments with you? Hound Dog nodded.
Sounds good. Talking to these kids is my job after all.
Perfect. Nezu smiled. Now that that's out of the way, does anyone have any good stories to share? Toshinori was silent for a moment, as he debated how to breach the subject of the dangers of having a quirkless student, and Power Loader had already launched into a story before he'd figured out what to say. Power Loader talked about his hyper student who had somehow managed to cause an explosion with a paperclip, a vial of salt water, and a pack of matches.
She just laughed and said explosions were vital for progress. I swear I can already feel my hair turning grey.
Shota rolled his eyes. He knew Power Loader was secretly proud. It happened every year. A student would come along, blowing things up left and right, and inevitably, they'd end up the top of their class. Power Loader had once even joked about the bigger their explosion, the bigger their potential. Shota didn't understand it himself, but then again, he didn't know anything about support items, so he supposed it must make sense to someone in the thick of things. When Power Loader had finished, Midnight laughed and talked to All Might.
What about you, All Might? Any students catch your eye?
All Might coughed up a little blood in surprise at being addressed directly, and sat frozen for a moment.
I have some concerns, he said slowly.
Nezu set down his teacup. And what would that be?
One of the students in the hero course is quirkless.
The entire room went silent.
And that is a problem because?
Shota knew he sounded angry, but this was his student All Might was talking about.
Had he even seen Deku completely annihilate his opponents in the combat exercise, or had he written him off completely as soon as he learned he was quirkless?
Deku looked at him incredulously.
It's incredibly dangerous. The student almost died because he was put in a combat student with quirk students. He almost died because his bully was led into UA.
Wait! Mike held up a hand.
Are we talking about Deku? Of course we're talking about Deku. Who else is quirkless here at UA?
Shota was practically yelling. Deku hadn't asked to be viciously attacked, yet here All Might was acting like it was all his fault. The fault for today's exercise, All Might, lies only with the student that attacked him with excessive force, Nezu said calmly. And that student has already been disciplined. It won't happen again.
How do you know that?
All Might turned to the principal.
Every time he is in a fight, he'll be outmatched. It's dangerous and unfair to both young Midoriya and those training to be heroes. Don't talk as if Deku is somehow less than other students, Aizawa growled. He has more potential for heroics than most first years I've taught, and he definitely has more than a student who attacked him.
Enough! Mike used his quirk to be heard above the bickering heroes. Shota glared at All Might, who was glaring back.
What makes you so concerned about Deku becoming a hero, All Might?
All Might looked between the teachers like he couldn't believe he had to explain something so obvious.
Quirkless people can't be heroes. They've never been able to, it's not their place. Are you even hearing yourself right now? Shota said. How can you be so prejudiced? A few years ago they said animals couldn't be heroes either, but I don't see you speaking out against the principal.
All Might crossed his arms.
Well, what are you basing your opinions off, huh? It sounds to me like you want to be inclusive, even if it puts Midoriya and other students at risk. That's not kindness, that's stupidity. Oh, that's rich coming from you.
Now, Aizawa, Nezu said. All Might raises a valid point. If Deku had not shown potential for heroics, we would not have let him in. Maybe you can explain to All Might why Deku is a good fit for the hero course. Shota laughed humorlessly.
Where do I start? Maybe the fact that he can break down and figure out how to counter a quirk within seconds? Or the fact he already has his gun license due to all the hours of training he spent with firearms? Training that, need I remind you, somehow wasn't required for Bakugo's gauntlets? Or, I don't know, maybe the fact that Deku convinced the entire underground he was a goddamn retired pro for 7 months until we finally met him? Is any of that good enough for you? I agree with you that he's intelligent, All Might said. But that doesn't mean he shouldn't stay behind the scenes where he'll be safe. Safe my ass! Shota yelled. Being a hero is dangerous for anyone, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. You should know that better than anyone. I do know that better than anyone, All Might said. That's exactly why I'm so against this. If even someone with a powerful quirk like mine can be injured so badly in the line of duty, a quirkless kid wouldn't last a day.
All Might apparently hadn't realized he'd powered up his muscle form until Shota cancelled his quirk and he deflated. Shota smirked at the confused look on the idiot's face. A loud rattle of china interrupted them, and they both turned to look at Nezu, who had slammed his teacup down on the saucer. That is quite enough of that, he said. All Might, Deku has been accepted to the hero course, and nothing you say is going to change that fact. This is not an inclusion initiative, but rather the simple fact that if I did not believe he could become a hero, I would not have let him in. Aizawa. He turned to Shota. I understand that you're upset, but you need to control yourself as well. The last thing UA needs is infighting amongst his teachers. Shota took a deep breath and sat down, as All Might did the same. He glared at All Might, who scowled back at him, and Shota looked away. He could keep things civil.
I wish the kid had taken my advice,
All Might grumbled. And Shota felt ice in his veins.
And what advice would that be?
All Might looked up in surprise. Apparently he hadn't planned on being heard. He glanced between Nezu and Shota, but it seemed Nezu was also curious, since he made no move to stop the conversation.
Well,
All Might cleared his throat.
I actually met young Midoriya for the first time almost a year ago. He stopped me after I saved him from a villain and asked me if he could become a hero.
And what did you tell him? Shota knew he wasn't imagining the hint of horror in Midnight's voice, but All Might didn't seem to notice.
I told him it was impossible, of course,
All Might said innocently.
It would have been cruel to say anything else. I encouraged him to try and be a doctor or a police officer if he was really honest about wanting to help people.
Shota stood up and walked out of the room. He didn't need the murder of the #1 hero on his resume. Toshinori watched Aizawa storm out of the room and shook his head. Aizawa would come around eventually. He turned back to his fellow teachers, who were staring at him with a mix of horror, anger, and disgust, and he furrowed his eyebrows in confusion.
What?